Hello and welcome to the LGBTQ Fall Discussion Series. This is actually our fourth event of the series for this semester and our last event of this semester. And so we have a very special event planned today because we brought in two people who are drag queens as well as folks who are knowledgeable about the science and public health behind the HIV and AIDS epidemic. And so today we'll be doing a little special event called Drag Me to Class, which will be hosted by, or I guess with the panelists, Jaja and Anita Sigg. So Jaja Dali and Anita Sigg are joining us today. Welcome.
Hello.
So I'm just going to let y'all introduce yourselves and tell us about who you are and what you do for your drag as well as for your day job or career path that led to you being panelists today.
Anita, you could go ahead and start.
Okay, well, how y'all doing? Y'all regular? Y'all pooping good? My name's Anita Sigg. Sigg spelled S-I-G-G because I'm not like other girls. I'm the human skid mark of Asbury Park, and I also work in public health. I do HIV testing and counseling, as well as HIV education and prevention. So basically what that means is my job is to create workshops where I teach safer sex tactics and harm reduction to young queer people.
Great, we love that.
Hi. I'm Jaja Dali, the Belkin Beltress of Philadelphia. I am a biologist by day. My specialty is cancer immunology. So while it's about HIV, I am very knowledgeable about the immune system as well as viruses. And yeah, I'm excited to be here and help you all understand HIV and AIDS.
And I'm excited to have both of you here. So the reason we've called this event Drag Me to Class is because Jaja and Anita actually did an episode of Drag Me to Class during the pandemic lockdown. And they were doing a digital show. And what was the topic of that when you did it together? I think it was something like about Victorian, like homosexuality or something.
Yeah, so I actually went to school for queer Victorian era literature is what I studied. That was my specialty. And Jaja was nice enough to let me babble about that on an episode of one of her Drag Me to Class shows. So that was super fun.
I watched and it was a lot of fun. It was very interesting. I'm always a big fan of like learning about the history of things. And actually that kind of leads us right into our first question. So a lot of our advancements have been made over the past 40 years because the pandemic is now 40 years old. The epidemic is now 40 years old. So what do these advancements mean for people living with HIV in 2021?
So those advancements thankfully mean that most people living with HIV can live normal, fulfilling lives with the same life expectancy as people who are negative for HIV, as long as the people who are HIV positive are regularly taking their treatments.
Yeah. And when we say treatments, we're really only talking about a single pill a day. So the way that you would take antidepressants or the way you would take your vitamins every morning is the same exact concept. So we're not even expecting real life-changing treatments or things in order to survive out of people living with HIV. Really, it's just a single pill a day, which before, back 40 years ago, you would have to take AZT, which if you've ever seen Rent, I don't want to reference it, but I have to. If you've ever seen Rent, AZT is essentially chemo in a pill. And that was not even going to save your life, but give you a couple extra months, even though those couple extra months were going to be painful. So now it's just been a complete 180 in that, yeah, you're taking one pill still, but you are, nothing's going to happen to you. You're going to be fine. Your immune system's going to build itself back up. And, everything, you're going to live the same normal life as any other HIV negative person around you.
Yeah, and I think I'm also thinking of Pose because there's actually like a discussion in I think the second season of Pose, where they were talking about how like the medication is worse than the disease, because they were referring to AZT, where it's like it makes you sick, it makes things like really like it is like chemo. You get really sick, it takes a toll on your body, but you get an extra few months. And so there was also a discussion of like, should I even take the pills or should I just die in peace and like let things run their course? Because back then it was really like a death sentence. And I feel like a lot of folks my age like remember kind of like the HIV scare in the 90s. It was kind of like, if you have gay sex once, you will get AIDS and die. Which of course even then was not necessarily a true statement, but it was a lot of that kind of fear mongering and like, I don't know, untold information. We have a question from Billy King. What does this pill do for HIV do? Does it boost the immune system?
So, you can go, Shasha.
Thank you. Before you can kind of answer that, you have to kind of like understand a little bit of the mechanism of how HIV works. What we're talking about is commonly referred to as ART, or antiretroviral treatment. And so when HIV infects a cell, specifically CD4 positive T cells, which are the white blood cells that basically turn on your immune system, the virus injects its own DNA inside of the cell, and the cell, not knowing any better, kind of takes that DNA and copies it and turns it into more viruses until the cell fills up with those viruses and bursts. So what ART treatments do is they halt that kind of DNA replication process and slow it down to allow the cells to have time to kind of sort through the DNA and go, hey, this isn't my DNA. Let's not make this.
It's really interesting. I think that's the first time I actually heard that mechanism described. Because normally it's just like, oh yeah, you just take a pill every day. Just take your Truvada, take whatever.
It is different than how Truvada or PrEP works too.
Yeah, because I've heard Truvada can be used as PrEP, which is a pre-exposure prophylactic, but it can also be used as an HIV treatment for folks who are positive, because I think insurance lists it as two different types of medication, like whether you're taking it for prevention or for treatment.
Yeah, how PrEP works is basically when you're using it as PrEP before your exposure, it basically helps prevent the virus from being able to penetrate your cells and inject its DNA rather than slowing down your DNA replication process.
Cool.
Do you have anything to add?
Oh, no, you explained it perfectly, much better than I would have. So
yeah, so I just want to get some of the more common questions out of the way. So what really is the difference between HIV and AIDS, and what is it? What does U equals U mean? Because that's a common thing that we talk about with HIV recently.
So when we're talking about HIV, it's important to distinguish between the two major factors or the two major indicators of if you have HIV. And those two things are viral load and T cell count. And T cells are essentially your white blood cells. How many of them do you have in your body? And your viral load is how much of the virus do you have in your body, right? So essentially, when you have any kind of viral load, I believe most labs it's above 40 cells infected with HIV. That's when you are detectable. That's when it shows up on a test. And that's when you can pass it on to other people. And with T cells, if your T cell count falls below 200, then you have AIDS. So if you have less than 200 white blood cells in your body, you have AIDS. That doesn't come for a long, long time after you get HIV. The only way you can get AIDS is by having HIV first and not doing anything medically intervening during your HIV diagnosis.
So AIDS would be a lot common.
Multiple people, actually, now the bulk percentage of people who are HIV positive that take their treatments never wind up developing AIDS. And the difference between HIV and AIDS is well, yes, AIDS has that lower T cell count, like Anita mentioned, that's when your immune system becomes completely compromised. It will be susceptible to other diseases that you normally would be able to fend off on your own with a healthy immune system. So HIV positive means you have the virus in you. It does not mean you are deathly ill. AIDS, unfortunately, means your immune system has completely been compromised, and that's when you get very, very extremely sick.
And so if you do fall into the category of having AIDS, is there any recourse? Is there any way to kind of get back to just having HIV?
Unfortunately, from all the literature I could go through, there doesn't look like there's any cases of people reversing their AIDS diagnosis. If you do still take your treatments, you are still capable of, living life from anywhere from a couple more months to a couple years, depending on a variety of factors. But it doesn't look like you can go from AIDS back to HIV.
So it's really about like the great thing about the medication is it prevents it from happening in the first place. So you don't find that yourself in that situation. And so kind of this having one pill a morning, that the advancements in the medication have really reduced the amount of AIDS cases that we see. And we focus more on managing viral load and managing HIV rather than having these hospital wards full of people with AIDS who are terminal, which is what we saw in the 80s and 90s.
Right.
Great. So speaking of which, like, since this has been around since the 80s and how different generations have gotten different messaging about it, what are some common misconceptions that you still hear and people still hold about HIV or AIDS?
I think one of the most common misconceptions that I've heard is that if you test positive, that you are always going to be able to pass on the virus to someone you had sex with, which kind of goes into, you mentioned earlier and we didn't get to it.
I forgot to answer the second part of the question.
That stands for undetectable equals untransmissible. So if you can't detect the viral load in your blood, Anita said it's underneath 40 cells that have it, I believe, then the chances of you transmitting HIV onto the next person is virtually zero.
Right. And so in layman's terms, when you're undetectable as an HIV positive person, when you're undetectable, that means you can slam dunk your load into a twink and they will not get it. Like, you can stuff him like the inside of a Twinkie and he will not get it. That's been one of the most frustrating things that I've seen entering my field is a lot of people living with HIV become celibate, essentially, because they would rather never have sex again than have to face the rejection of the uneducated, that like these uneducated people that they want to have sex with, and they try to explain you equals you, but they don't get it, and they don't want to get it because of the 40 plus years of fear mongering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there. In addition to U equals U, there's also things like PrEP, which we mentioned already. So both those things together, if you are taking PrEP, you have a virtually 0% chance of contracting HIV unless some sort of extenuating circumstances or higher risk factors can break. Which is like I think one to three people on PrEP have contracted HIV, and a lot of it was because they skipped doses or because they were engaging in high risk behavior. So 3 people out of thousands, millions of people taking this medication is actually a fantastic rate. And then you have U equals U, where it's virtually impossible to transmit it, because if the viral load is low, you're obviously not able to spread the virus because you don't have enough virus in your system to do so. So if you are taking PrEP and you are with someone who knows their viral load and is undetectable, that is actually safer than having any other type of sex with a person whose status is unknown. Because if the person whose status is unknown, they could have a high viral load and a very, very resilient strain.
And statistically speaking, actually, you have a better chance of not catching anything. having sex with a undetectable person than with a HIV negative person, because the undetectable person is getting tested every 3 months, is taking medications that make sure they don't pass anything on to anybody. So this whole idea that you should be scared of people with HIV and you should be scared of having sex with people living with HIV is essentially just parroting back to that fear mongering that Ronald Reagan was starting back in the 80s.
Yeah.
And the U equals U also goes into the misconception that people who are HIV positive can't have children. Because if you are on treatment and you are undetectable, you can give birth to a child who is not HIV positive, thankfully.
Yeah, and that's actually been the case for over a decade, if not 2 decades at this point. Like they found pretty early on that they were able to figure out how to safely deliver a child without the child contracting HIV from their parent. So yeah, that's been true for a long time. I remember learning that when I was in college or in even high school.
And the other misconception that really bothers me is this whole idea that you get it from quote unquote dirty sex, or this kind of I don't know how to say it. This kind of like
Particularly kinky or like just
like kinky, seemingly unsafe predicaments, kind of underground settings for sex, like orgies, kink spaces, bathhouses, etc., etc. That's not, you get it by just one time. You get it by not asking the right question one time. You get it by misjudging somebody one time. So I've known plenty of people that have contracted the virus through having sex with somebody who was getting tested regularly, but they just didn't get tested in that window period. And they gave it to somebody unknowingly and contracted it. So in that super complicated scenario, it was quote unquote normal sex, a normal hookup, but that's how they contracted it.
Yeah, I feel like also people just kind of like, well, I know this person, so they're safe.
Right.
And the same thing with the current pandemic. It's like, oh, like I trust this person. It's like, yeah, you can trust them all they want. They can still contract a virus and give it to you. Being a good person or being a cautious person doesn't protect you completely from any other risk factors. And it's like kind of a false sense of security, because someone who you may perceive as dirty may be STI free, and someone who is your friend may have a bunch of STIs and they haven't been tested in 3 years.
Right.
I want to also point out the verbiage that you used there, which was really good. A lot of people say that when they don't have an STI or HIV that they're clean, which then implies if you have it, you're dirty, which is another misconception. So it's much better, more inclusive to just simply say you tested positive for something rather, or you tested negative, than saying that you're clean.
Yeah, I mean, we don't judge people for getting a cold or getting the flu. You get those by being in contact with other people, but I think there's also the shame and stigma around sex and sexual contraction, that it's like, oh, you deserve this. There's like this moral attachment to this idea of like bad behavior equals negative consequences. And it's like, no, an STI is not a consequence. It is just a thing that happens. It's a reality of life. People in close contact can transmit diseases to each other. All right. So, what do you think the future of the HIV epidemic will look like?
Well, I know that there's talks of a vaccine happening, which I think we're going to talk about later, but is super exciting. I know that in public health, we're talking about different strategies to have the number of positive cases go down from, I believe it's 300,000 people a year, down to 3,000 people a year by 2025. And while obviously that's an ambitious goal, in public health, and especially on the national level, we actually are on track to do that with PrEP, with viral suppressants, and other HIV treatments. We really are on track to do that. So what is going to get us to that future is by getting tested, is by taking your medication, and by getting on PrEP for my HIV negative people. I know that you probably might feel like getting medication is such a to-do and it's expensive and blah, blah, blah. Thankfully, the government is paying attention to this and has made programs specifically so that it's easy for you to get what you need to protect yourself.
Yeah, I believe most places you can get PrEP for free, either completely covered by your insurance or by using a copay card. And now PrEP has been around long enough that you can now get a generic version of the pill, which should be covered 100% by any insurance, and can also be can be prescribed at public health centers that prescribe it for free for folks without insurance.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's really easy. It's literally like a 15-minute doctor's appointment. You go up, they draw a little bit of blood or saliva to do an STD panel. They do a quick physical. They ask you 5 short questions about your sex behavior, and then they hand you the paperwork, and you write down your insurance information, and ta-da, you're on PrEP.
I think they do some blood work for the first few months to test liver function, make sure that you're not reacting negatively, because there is a side effect that is not super common but does happen for some folks. So yeah, like, and that's another thing is like when you're on PrEP, you get tested every 3 months. Same thing as folks who are in HIV treatment and taking pills. Like the every 3 months testing is another safety measure where knowing your status allows you to make informed decisions and allows people you sleep with to have to make informed decisions as well. So, Jaja, did you want to chime in anything else about the future of the pandemic or epidemic? Also, what is the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic, and why do we call like the HIV epidemic an epidemic rather than pandemic?
That is do you want to go ahead, Anita?
I think I know the answer. Someone in the chat or one of you two can Google this to see if I'm right. A pandemic is something that happens worldwide to everybody, and an epidemic is a disease that is spread specifically through a group of people through a certain period of time.
Okay.
I think.
Checks out.
That checks out?
Yep.
I know I went to school for words, but I still struggle with them, so.
Mood. So, Jaja, you actually know a little bit more about the science behind these things. So when we're talking about this vaccine trial, that is an mRNA vaccine, which is the same thing that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines for COVID are. They're the same type of vaccine. So when we hear about this mRNA vaccine for HIV making it to trial stages and the really high efficacy of the mRNA vaccine for COVID, what is so special about mRNA, and how does it work differently from other types of vaccines?
Right. So mRNA is messenger RNA, for those of you who don't know. And messenger RNA is kind of like the blueprint for making DNA and proteins. So it's the last stage in the DNA replication process to translate something into a protein. So when we use these vaccines, we're pretty much just putting in RNA, which then the cell's taken and manufactured, kind of similarly to a virus, except for it's not going to keep going indefinitely. And then it makes specific proteins that are specific to that disease that our immune system can then basically train itself to be able to recognize. And this is different from a normal vaccine where we would maybe take isolated proteins or a killed or attenuated version of the virus or bacteria or whatever it is and inject it in and just let the body have at it. And it's special and kind of has an advantage over normal vaccines because you're able to change specifications on the vaccines much quicker than you would with traditional ones. If you were to have a new variant show up, it utilizes your immune system kind of like in a different channel. The immune system is basically a series of just different pathways that all interact. So rather than having external things come in and it takes longer for the chain of command to break it down and process it, your cells are just churning it out and holding it up and saying, look what I found, instead of having to break it apart and go, what is this? Figure it out and then hold it up and say, look what I found.
Yeah, so a lot of folks have asked like questions about vaccines and safety, especially with COVID, and the vaccines being a huge part of the cultural conversation right now. So when it comes to, like, I think with COVID, they reproduced just the spike instead of the whole, like, because we see the spiky ball. So instead of making this spiky ball, it just makes a little spike protein and repeats that. So then your white blood cells can recognize the spike. So it's like not even like there's any virus in your system, right? It's just like this fake out to teach your immune system how to fight the real virus without putting the real virus in your system.
Exactly. It's just making a specific protein that is unique to that virus without making the whole entire virus.
And your body like actually processes the vaccine and like works through the body and it leaves the body eventually, correct?
Correct.
It doesn't stay in your system forever.
Yeah, mRNA vaccinations, the RNA doesn't integrate into your DNA. So, like, some viruses have specific proteins, specific coding, where it will actually kind of join part of your DNA and kind of be there forever. Even if your immune system learns to recognize it and control the infection, you can still always find it hiding somewhere in your body. With mRNA vaccines, they don't have that special codon to stay in there. So as soon as it goes through all of the floating pieces of mRNA, that's it. There's no more mRNA. It's not moving anymore. But the reason why we can have lasting immunity is our immune systems have um, varying degrees of memory for recognizing antigens or foreign proteins. And so for COVID, it happens to be around like 6 to 8 months of memory, which is why that's when we need our booster.
And so I think I read somewhere that the mRNA vaccines are processed and are out of your system within like 72 hours, like 3 days of after taking the vaccine. And I read somewhere that because it's like not staying in your system long term, it kind of is processed by the body and leaving, like the only thing that stays behind is that memory in the T cells that teach it how to fight the virus. There's actually like not even really a risk for long-term health effects or long-term damage from vaccines like this as well, right?
Correct. The only way, well, there's always a risk, but these ones specifically have been studied and we haven't found that risk. And the earliest mRNA vaccine studies, which mRNA vaccines have been being developed since the 80s and 90s, and we've come a long way since then. They were originally developed for, I can't remember what virus, but then they really picked up again when Ebola was kicking around.
Yes, that was during the Obama administration.
Say that again?
And the Ebola scare was towards the end of the Obama administration.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they were able to stop, I think they had this like epidemic team that basically stopped anything from spreading. They only had 5 cases in the US before they were able to kind of isolate and quarantine.
Yeah, but anyway, the very first mRNA vaccine, some people had such a bad immediate immune reaction that it basically they basically wound up with an autoimmune disorder. So thankfully, we've learned how to adjust the vaccine so we don't have that happen anymore, because now they're much more specific with what the mRNA codes for, rather than kind of coding for multiple proteins or larger segments of the disease.
All right. So since we kind of already kind of crossed the line into talking about HIV and other pandemics and epidemics, specifically COVID, what can we learn about epidemiology and public health from studying the history of the HIV epidemic? And how has this information been used in combating the COVID-19 pandemic?
So I can kind of talk about this because my program came out of the program that I work for came out of the HIV AIDS epidemic. A lot of what we learned is federal intervention saves lives. As much as a lot of us are not a fan of the government, federal intervention really does save lives. Because if you look back in the 80s, what was killing us was the fact that the government wasn't paying attention to us. And now we have hundreds upon thousands and thousands of programs just in our country alone to fight the good fight against HIV. So, what that means is the creation of community based organizations that are funded federally. So, what that means is community members coming together and establishing a program that is funded by the government. The government essentially gives us millions of dollars a year to say, do what you think needs to be done with this. Yes, they give us certain parameters and we have to hit certain numbers and etc. But in public health, we've been able to save lives, get people medicated, get people treated, get people on PrEP, and that's what's gotten our numbers down. And when COVID hit, the first people that the government called was community-based HIV testing clinics. Because we've dealt with this, we're still dealing with this. And so we know how to deal with a community-wide pandemic. We were the first ones out there on the ground in our little testing vans with our nasal swabs and everything else when we had to tickle your brain. And we were out there testing hours and hours a day. And that's how we were able to get people diagnosed. We were able to get people quarantined. So federal intervention and community-based initiatives. So support your local nonprofits for sure.
Yeah, and so what are some of the lessons that we have actually like pulled from there as far as like the public health aspect of like reaching out to folks who are either like resistant to learning new information or like don't want to like follow the news or read up on these things, or folks who are like unsure of the science or afraid of vaccines or concerned about the government? Like, what are the best ways to kind of reach folks who are resistant to like just kind of saying, here's this free public healthcare, come get it, and are like just kind of more cautious?
So sadly, I don't think this is the answer that anybody wants to hear. It's the answer I don't want to tell, but I've been trained to tell. We do public health is all about harm reduction, not harm abstinence. In other words, we meet people where they're at. If you don't trust us, if you don't trust the government, if you don't trust the vaccine, it is not our job it's not anybody's job but your own to convince you otherwise. We can do all the education in the world. I still do all the education in the world about COVID and HIV. And if they don't want to receive it, it's not my job to force it down their throats. It's not anybody in public health's job to force it down anybody's throats. And that's obviously that makes them not the greatest people, because that kind of behavior and that kind of thought process is actually what's keeping us in the pandemic. And even in the HIV epidemic, people that don't want to get on PrEP, people that are HIV positive that don't want to take their medication because they're scared of what it'll do to their body.
Bug chasers.
Right. Oh, bug chasers for sure. And those kind of behaviors and those kind of people are what is keeping us in this. So I would encourage, if there is anybody questioning the vaccine or HIV medications or PrEP, do everything you can to do your research, talk to a doctor that you trust. Like I said, it's not my job to force you, but it is my job to encourage you.
Yeah, I mean that's also what I hear a lot is like it's all about encouraging, because shame is a terrible motivator, and trying to shame people into doing things just like does not work.
Right.
And so they have to be like open and willing to do it. And so it's, I guess, having like those conversations, especially with friends and family, folks who may listen to you, encouraging them to do their research and to look into those things. Because yeah, at the end of the day, you can't force anyone to do these things. And that's actually, I think, why they're talking a lot about like vaccine mandates and employer mandates and things like that, because people who are kind of conflicted are going to avoid even doing anything and avoid even looking into it just because they just don't want to deal with it. But if you're told, well, you have to do this or you're going to lose your job, or you have to do this in order to continue to coming into this space, then they're kind of presented with like a, well, I better do my research now and figure it out instead of waiting and putting it off, because there's a direct thing that impacts my ability to live my life without a vaccine or without this treatment.
Right. And it's a little easier to do it with COVID than HIV, because with HIV, the really not it's not shame that we're trying to instill in people when we're encouraging people to get on PrEP or positive people to get on medications. Um, and we're not trying to fearmonger. We're just trying to instill what I call common sense into them. Uh, but with COVID, it's kind of just the government can do that. The government's not going to go into every neighborhood and be like, you need a stamp to show you're on PrEP. If you are a person living with HIV, you need a stamp to show you're taking your meds, because they can't do that. So HIV, in a way, is a little harder to regulate that way than COVID is.
Yeah. Although HIV transmission is also easier to avoid through communication and
Yes.
kind of looking out for yourself, whereas COVID is also one of those things where it's like you can do everything right, but if someone who is infected comes up and coughs in your face, it doesn't really like matter, because your mask or whatever is not, or your vaccine may not protect you if you have a direct exposure like that. And so it's like because it's a pandemic rather than an epidemic, we really need to do things like that to really combat the spread. Otherwise, it just kind of goes unchecked.
Absolutely.
So that's like all of our planned questions. So I wanted to open it up into the audience to see if anyone, especially Billy, who's been very engaged in commenting along, if there's any other follow-up questions or information that we wanted to talk about.
In the meantime, I can talk about why it's been hard to get an HIV vaccine and why it's taken so long.
Yeah. Oh, please. I would love to hear this.
So HIV is one of the most mutable viruses out there. It mutates much, much faster than COVID. It mutates much, much faster than influenza. So there's a variety of strains, which is also why it's hard to treat when you have it, because one treatment might work for someone else, but that same treatment might not work for you. Because the proteins on the surface and internally are changing very rapidly. So it's hard to get a vaccine that targets everything. So what researchers have been looking into doing with the mRNA vaccines is using the mRNA vaccine to target a very specific subset of B cells that create what are called BNAbs, or broadly neutralizing antibodies. And these antibodies are capable of targeting, like, I think it's like close to 75 to 80% of HIV strains, and are effective in neutralizing them. But the problem is in your body produces a very small amount of these antibodies naturally. I think it's about 25% of HIV patients naturally produce low to moderate levels of BNAb antibodies. So it's a mechanism your body's naturally using to fight HIV, but it can't produce enough of it nor fast enough to neutralize the HIV on its own.
Yeah. So that DNA replication process is a fairly slow process, or like really. And you also mentioned, I think, I don't know if you mentioned this on camera or if this is our conversation beforehand, but that T cells are also slow to replenish.
Yes, so all immune cells, once they are mature, and they're mature once they are activated and are ready to, and are capable of recognizing a specific antigen. kind of a step back. Immune cells, both T cells and B cells, kind of sit there in their immature state and aren't active, and then they get shown an antigen or something that's foreign to the body, and then they're only capable of kind of targeting that one thing, and they're mature. And once they reach that mature stage, they don't progenate or replicate. So it's kind of hard sometimes to maintain those mature immune cell populations.
We do have an audience question. Billy asks, is HIV AIDS protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act?
So I'm not 100% familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act, but I will say that it is actually now illegal for jobs, banks, really anybody in a professional or legal setting to ask if you have HIV or AIDS, because now it's a non-factor because it has nothing to do with your life expectancy. So I don't know if y'all know, but back in the 80s, if you tried to get a mortgage or if you tried to get a loan of any kind or a job, people would ask if you had HIV or AIDS because they wanted to know if you were going to live long enough for them to get their money back, or for you to be a decent worker. So now that is something that they cannot ask. They're not allowed to. So I believe that falls under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I just looked it up, and apparently the Americans with Disability Act was amended by Congress in 2008, making it easier for people with HIV or AIDS to demonstrate that they are persons with disabilities who are covered by the statute, because the virus, especially when unmedicated, substantially limits the functions of their immune system. So yes, HIV is covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act.
And I do want to mention that both symptomatic and asymptomatic people with HIV are covered under the ADA. Because now, thankfully, a bulk of people that are HIV positive are living their lives asymptomatic. And a lot of people always try to be like, oh, you don't actually have a disability if you don't have symptoms, but too bad the ADA doesn't agree with that.
Because it's also possible if you, I believe it's possible even if you have a strain that is easily controlled by drugs, it could also eventually build up resistance, and you could have to either switch medications, or if you stop treatment at any point, you lose your insurance. You could wind up having a higher viral load, lower T cell count. And so just because treatment is working right now doesn't mean it's always going to be working. And so just because your disability is able to be treated doesn't mean that you don't have a disability anymore. That being said, the ADA also leaves a lot to be desired, because a lot of times in order to enforce the ADA, you have to sue people for violating the ADA and then prove that they violated the ADA. It's just not necessarily granted. So that is a big limitation. For example, with wheelchair ramps, you can build a building without a wheelchair ramp, and it's as long as the ADA has not been implemented into the building code of that city or municipality, you can legally do that until someone sues you and says that you should have put in a ramp because it's under the ADA. So it puts the burden on people with disabilities to have to sue private companies to get basic rights. So there is something also to be left to be desired there. And then I guess the other thing with, like Anita said, the discrimination piece is also, employment discrimination is another thing that people face. I've also heard from a lot of friends about I feel like most of my friends with HIV actually are undetectable. Yet a lot of them still report a lot of issues on dating sites. I think Anita alluded to this a little bit earlier in the presentation. But there's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of people saying people with STIs are dirty, people not wanting to sleep with someone who is HIV positive, even though that person is undetectable, getting tested regularly, knows their status and their risk level. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of discrimination that happens and a lot of misconceptions that are still there.
And there's always, with whether it's a pandemic or an epidemic, there's always kind of like an othering that happens. Like we saw it with COVID with the Asian community, where they were very like othered and discriminated against. With HIV, originally it was all like, like it was the gay disease, and now it's just kind of grossly discriminatory.
Yeah, because of course, like any human being who comes in contact with any of these viruses can contract them. It's not limited to one community. Clearly, it's not just limited to Asian Americans or Asians in general, because it's a pandemic. Everyone is at risk for COVID now. It's spread around the entire world. And with HIV, people who are not part of the LGBT community can get it. It's not just gay people and drug users. Like anybody who has sex, anyone who shares bodily fluids can contract HIV regardless of their sexual orientation. And so a lot of these othering and discrimination that happens are really unfounded, and just kind of like leaning into scapegoating and having someone to blame. So I think that really wraps up our questions and our presentation. We have a few minutes left if either of you would like to kind of add anything, if anything that you researched for this that you didn't get a chance to talk about, or anything you just kind of want to add that you didn't get a chance to say.
I think that now would probably be a good time to orate the list of testing centers that we compiled in Philadelphia.
Yes. So there's actually a so first and foremost, so Philadelphia actually runs public health clinics. And so there is Health Center 1 through Health Center 8, which are all around the city. And so Health Center 1 is the main STI clinic for the city, and it's located at right near Broad and Snyder. It's one block up from the subway stop on Snyder. It's at the corner of Broad and McKean. And that location does drop-in STI testing, I believe, every weekday starting at 8 a.m. And that's one of the best places to just kind of drop in and go. In addition to Philadelphia Health Center 1, Health Center 2 does HIV testing, as well as the Washington West Project, which is run by Mazzoni, and that's right in the neighborhood at Locust and 12th, I believe, right near Knock and Odyssey Hair Studio, and like just down the street from Taboo. Philly AIDS Thrift, I'm not sure what their schedule is with the pandemic, but they have a testing room on their second floor, and they invite local testing organizations to come by and do testing in those rooms. So they have a schedule on their website with not only when they're doing testing, but which local organization is providing that testing. And some of the organizations that do that testing are further down on my list. So we have the Mazzoni Center, Philadelphia Fight, Galay, Babashi. Those are all organizations that do HIV testing and LGBTQ focused healthcare. Those are listed on our website as well. But the City of Philadelphia's government website, phila.gov, actually has a Get Tested for HIV website that not only kind of lists information and about for HIV and some common asked questions, but it has a map of all of the community health centers and HIV testing sites around the city that are both publicly and privately owned. And I'm putting that link in the comments right now. That's phila.gov/services/physical mental health. And then you'll be able to get into the different mental and physical health information available through the city. It's actually wonderful that the city of Philadelphia compiled that stuff, because a lot of places don't make it easy to find that information and put it all in one place. So yeah, that's Philadelphia specific stuff. Anita also works over in Asbury, if you want to kind of talk about the work that you do and the service you work for, because I know if there's folks watching from Asbury, they may want to know about that.
Yeah, so if you are in Monmouth and Ocean County of New Jersey, I work for the Visiting Nurses Association, and which is the umbrella company, but really the program I work for is Prevention Resource Network in Asbury Park. Our address is 816 Sunset Avenue, and we do HIV, COVID, and syphilis testing Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 4:30. I also work at Project Real, which is a program that works under Prevention Resource Network, and we're a drop-in center. We are open Tuesdays and Thursdays from 5 to 10. You can find our calendar of all of our events on our Instagram, Project Real AP. And there we have drop-in social events. We have safe sex talks. We have trans time, which is our sort of drop-in social space specifically for trans clients. And we also do a ton of lives. We do kink talks where we kind of talk about how to have safer kink sessions. And we also have our real talk, which is our not your mama's sex talk kind of thing, where we teach you how safer sex tactics and harm reduction tactics on how to prevent HIV and other STDs.
Thank you, Anita. Well, actually, I'm going to be a little bit of a nerd for a second because I find this very, very cool. I think it's very appropriate that our guests are from Philadelphia and Asbury Park because those are actually two LGBT community cities with very big LGBT communities that actually came out of the HIV epidemic. A lot of people don't realize this, but like before the HIV epidemic, it was like New York, San Francisco. Those are your gay cities, and that's about it. And that's where a lot of healthcare and a lot of information about the AIDS epidemic and HIV really started and came out of. But like in other parts of the country, a lot of these smaller pockets of LGBTQ populations actually came out of where they could go for treatment for HIV. And so there was an HIV hospital, I believe, in Asbury Park or some sort of community health organization that was working specifically with HIV, or an HIV like ward in the hospital. Philadelphia had the Mazzoni Center and a few other like organizations. And so LGBTQ folks specifically came to Washington Square West or Rittenhouse prior to that, and to Asbury Park because in New Jersey, in South Jersey, in Pennsylvania, those were the places where they could go to make sure that they could get treatment if they were HIV positive, or if their partner was, or if their friends were. And those became the community. So the gayborhood in Philadelphia exists because Mazzoni and other HIV focused organizations exist here. And Asbury has Asbury Pride and a lot of LGBTQ organizations and a few LGBTQ clubs and like businesses, specifically because Asbury was a place for folks in New Jersey to go for HIV treatment. So
yeah, and
things.
Asbury as well, specifically in the 90s, a lot of queer people wanted to escape the cities because that's where HIV was rampant. And so they thought that moving to a small little beach town was what would, they'd be able to escape the high risk. So then when that kind of didn't prove 100% to be true, that's when the HIV wards started opening up and stuff like that. So really it was to escape HIV, and then all the treatment stuff kind of came after once they realized that they couldn't really escape it.
Yeah, all it takes is one person visiting from a city that is experiencing the epidemic to then travel and transmit it to someone else, and then it spreads from there.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what happened that's how New York got it, because it started in San Francisco. And then that's how London got it, because someone was visiting from New York. And I know that makes it sound like just a very small, simple incident, but in a time where we had no idea what HIV was, it wasn't even called HIV at the time. Of course, it spread rampantly.
It was called like what, GRID? The first time they named it.
It was called GRID, gay-related immune disease, or immune disease. And this was also in a time where gay culture was thriving, in that you had bathhouses on every corner. You had dick ducks everywhere in every beach town. Sex was the pinnacle of our culture at the time. So of course it was spreading like nobody's business.
Well, I'm trying to like imagine what the world would be like if this, like, so the sexual liberation of the 70s had continued into the 80s, but instead, like, well, I keep saying pandemic. This epidemic is actually part of the reason why. Well, it's had such a huge impact on the LGBT community that I don't even know if I could really do it justice in talking about all of the things that have kind of come out of this epidemic. But if you think about like Hollywood, think about all the remakes that are happening, all the really terrible, like, so many LGBTQ folks in Hollywood died during the initial, like, in the 80s and 90s, at the beginning of the epidemic, that like we lost so many creatives. And so like imagine an industry that is like, not to say that only LGBTQ folks could be creative, but like, let's be real.
Not wrong.
But like, think about how much more like original and creative stories we would have if the industry hadn't just lost so many amazing creative people. Think of how many famous actors, directors, artists died during the beginning of the epidemic. Think about how like the government ignoring the epidemic and just allowing it to continue to spread rampantly without any interventions, because they didn't care that drug users and LGBTQ folks were getting infected because they thought it would never get to them. Like, all of these things had a huge impact and huge shape on our society as a whole. And like that, you have to wonder if the 70s were all about sexual liberation, it makes no sense that we kind of became more puritanical about sex and even more like prudish about sex. But then you think about, well, people were like, if you have sex, you'll get AIDS and die.
Exactly.
It kind of creates this like puritanical, like abstinence only focus that was really widespread when most of us were younger.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is our culture and who we are as queer people has really been sanitized because of the AIDS epidemic. And the representation of us has been sanitized. And that's why as we've become more accepted, we've kind of strayed into this, what I call homonormative kind of space, where you have that kind of preppy, clean cut, white gay who's basically straight except for who he goes to bed with that night. That identity really came out of this fear and the puritization, sanitization of who we are as queer people. Because before that, we really were just F-slurs running around, limp wrists and all, you know. And then when we all started dying at a rapid pace, we were like, we got to get with the heterosexual program, or we're gonna die.
Yeah, like so many people actually we're they entered monogamous relationships and we're only sleeping with one person, and that way like no one else can possibly infect us because we're not sleeping with anyone else but each other.
Right.
Which of course is not necessarily how things work, because people are not always faithful in monogamous relationships. But when you have a bunch of especially white cis men who are kind of partnering up and entering these monogamous relationships and protecting themselves from HIV in that way, folks with less privilege are the ones who are kind of being ravaged by this virus and having it like really decimate their communities. And so people who are possibly more radical, who had like more like liberal ideas around sex and sexuality, who were less conventional and possibly had less resources, were higher at risk for getting really ill and possibly die, or in that case definitely dying, because there was no treatment or cure or anything. It's just, it's wild how much that has shaped the LGBT community, because also those are the people who then were able to accrue financial stability by kind of being heteronormative and conforming to heteronormative society out of necessity during the pandemic, gaining some sort of mainstream success, being able to then kind of exist in workspaces without discrimination, accrue money, and then put that money into organizations like HRC and then telling them you need to focus on marriage equality because we want to get married, you need to focus on this because we want this, focus on this, and then forget other things because it's not important to us. So then you have like the homeless youth population, the HIV epidemic, all these things that are like really top priorities that are being ignored because the folks who actually have money in our community are prioritizing things that are important to them. And so like you can actually kind of blame this like privileged separation from the most privileged to the most marginalized within our community on the AIDS epidemic as well.
Absolutely.
So
because even today, the survivability of HIV is a class issue. If you are privileged enough to have insurance, if you're privileged enough to have access to programs, all of that, that means you can survive. You can have this life expectancy that we're talking about. You can live this normal life that we're talking about, right? But if you're poor, if you don't have insurance, if you don't have access to these programs, you don't have that kind of privilege, then it's not set up for you to thrive and survive. So AIDS has always been a class issue, and it was really exacerbated.
We also kind of see a similar thing with COVID too, where, you know, like I think that's something we also learned from the epidemic, and that's something that's kind of been considered a lot with the treatment style of COVID is, you know, can we get these resources to the underprivileged, to underdeveloped areas?
Yeah.
Can we get vaccines out there? Can the vaccines be stable long enough to be delivered? How can we make this affordable to everyone to get out of this?
Yeah, I mean, like, there's also like the ability to work from home, the ability to telecommute is something that is not offered to entry level workers or workers who do blue collar or working class jobs. And so, like, so many of my friends with working class families have had so many deaths in their families because their family members had to continue going to work. And we talk about this. We talk about this kind of employee shortage, this worker shortage, which of course has to do a lot with the non-living wages and terrible working conditions. But it also has to do with the fact that a bunch of people who worked in those jobs died during the pandemic. Like thousands of people died who were line cooks, servers, bartender, like all of these jobs where you're interacting with the public had severe loss. The majority of, I don't want to say the majority, but a big chunk of the deaths from COVID were in working class people and people with compromised immune system, older people as well. But like, if you were staying at home isolated with your family and one person was going out grocery shopping and everyone was working telecommuting from home, your family is a much safer situation than a family that has one person working at ShopRite and one person working as a mechanic and one person working in like some sort of retail environment. Like that's going to be a much higher risk. So there is always a class element because people who have money will figure out a way to protect themselves. And so the only way that we can actually protect everybody is to do things that are like federally funded. Getting federal funding for HIV was a huge step, like Anita said before. Having some sort of federal intervention is super important. Having the vaccine program sent out federally to make sure it gets to rural areas, using our network of CVS and Walgreens pharmacies that have contract with the government to have vaccines readily available in these communities that are hard to reach otherwise. All of these things are really important to be coordinated at a federal level for it to actually have an impact. And that's also why universal healthcare would be super helpful in this situation, because it wouldn't matter if you had insurance or not, because you'd just be covered.
That part.
So, on that soapbox, we're going to end this event because we are now actually about 10 minutes over time. But I just want to cut the conversation short. So thank you both for being here and for staying a little bit extra. Thank you all for watching. This is going to stay up, so if you have any friends you'd like to send this to, you can send this YouTube link out to folks. It's going to remain up on our website as an educational resource for the foreseeable future. So thank you both for being here.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Yes, and have a great rest of your semester, and happy World AIDS Day.